righty. Well, welcome everybody to our December lecture, the last lecture of 2024, the last of the 3 fall lectures. I'm pleased to announce we've been renewed for another season. So we will continue. I'll say something in the end about what we're going to do January, February, March. Same schedule. It'll be a Tuesday night. I think January 14th is not the second Tuesday, it's the third, but then in February, March, it'll be the second Tuesday. We'll try and stick to that schedule. But my topic for tonight is Dante Alighieri. Before we get into all of that, because this is going to be recorded and it's going to be available on a couple of different YouTube channels, so I need to do a little bit of introductory here about the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, which is the organization that's sponsoring all of this. We're doing this under their auspices, which is easy to do because my wife and I are the directors. But it was founded in 2004. Our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And we are, of course, adopted the name of Francis Schaeffer. He's a very influential 20th century theologian and sort of worldview critic, and very widely read, loved to quote from literature and music and the arts and movies. So in addition to sponsoring this lecture series, the Schaeffer Study Center offers a high school program built around a chronological study of Western civilization. We start with the ancient world in the 9th grade and we finish with the 20th century. I know that's starting to sound old. Somebody asked me the other day, I have a source here from the late 20th century. Can I use that? And I'm like, okay, I'm from the late 20th century, but it's okay. Yeah, we have to start talking about 21st century history now. Here's me. Been married for 47 years. I had to update this slide for this lecture because last month I had 20 grandchildren and now I have 21. So 9 boys and 12 girls. The youngest 2 were born October 12th and November 29th. October 12th was Amanda Beth Shearer, and November 29th was Elsie Jean Steves. So 2 more little girls, 2 cousins who are going to grow up together. Lots of fun. And I have done a bunch of things in my career, but I am, by calling, by passion, by delight and interest, a historian. I love the stories of history. I love researching history. I love teaching history. And I love the great books programs, but I love historical figures. I also love traveling with high school students. So at some point, I will be leading another trip to Italy and Germany. We do a Renaissance Reformation tour. We spend a week in Italy and then a week in Germany. And that is in the Vatican archives, the Vatican Museum, Raphael's famous fresco of the School of Athens. And that's me trying to explain it all to a group of students. So, all right, Dante Alighieri, 1265 to 1321. So by dates, he is a figure from the Middle Ages, but by temperament and by cultural style, he can really be counted as modern, at least in the same sense that Chaucer is modern. He's not much earlier than Chaucer. Chaucer comes just a little bit later than him. And what he left behind as literary output is just astonishing and has been incredibly influential. Here are the 3 volumes in the Penguin edition of the Commedia, which really for him was one work, sort of a trilogy with one story, one set of characters that he follows all the way through. And he wrote in Italian, which was very unusual for this time period. The language of the Middle Ages had been Latin, classical Latin, and then Church Latin, which was kind of a simplified form. The Renaissance begins to recover the more ornate flourishes of classical Republican Latin. But Dante chose to write in Italian, and he actually wrote in the Tuscan dialect of Italian, of which the Florentines are inordinately proud. They claim Dante and have references to him all over their city, but they exiled him. They booted him out of the city because he got caught on the wrong side of a political quarrel. And he spent 30 years in exile and died in exile and is buried in Ravenna. And every now and then, the Florentines write to Ravenna and say, we have a tomb prepared in Santa Croce, and we would love to have, and Ravenna goes, nope, you kicked him out, he died here, we're keeping him. So he is buried in Ravenna, but the Florentines have him everywhere. The world that Dante imagines is astonishing and unique. There is a structure and a geography, but he's aware that he's inventing a place that doesn't exist. He doesn't pretend that this is actually what hell looks like. This is actually what purgatory looks like. But he creates this very concrete three-dimensional structure, and the protagonist of the story is Dante-the-Pilgrim. And you have to kind of discipline yourself as you're reading it to distinguish between Dante-the-Pilgrim, the character in the story, and Dante the poet, who is writing the account and writing the lines for everybody that Dante the Pilgrim talks to. So it begins in Inferno. It actually begins with Dante lost in a dark wood, trying to climb up a mountain and being thwarted by encountering three different animals: a lion, a leopard, and a panther. And all of a sudden, someone appears and says, I've been sent from heaven to guide you, to help you recover your way. You're lost. You're having a midlife crisis. He was 35. The pilgrim is 35. Midway this way of life we're bound upon. And that starts the journey, which begins in this wood outside Jerusalem, and he goes down through all the levels of hell, and then continues down. That's the center of the earth, and emerges on the other side of the earth at the base of an island. And on the island is a mountain, which he then ascends. And at the top, he is met by Beatrice. And then in the last third, he ascends through the spheres of heaven into the presence of God. So it's an audacious itinerary. We'll talk more about that. By the way, I have 50 slides, and I'm not going to get through all of them. I'm going to go rapidly through all of this. I'll talk a bit about who was Dante. I'll talk a lot about what is the Divine Comedy. I'll talk a little bit about how it has shaped other authors in later centuries, and a bit about what should 21st century students hope to gain, 21st century readers of Dante. So I am curious, help me get started. Tell me one thing that you already know about Dante. You knew before you got here tonight. Dante's Inferno. Yep. He's really interested in Greek myths. Yes, he is. Beatrice is his crush. And I'm going to insist on Beatrice, because the rhythm of the lines doesn't scan properly unless you give it the full 4 syllables. So, yeah, Beatrice. And we'll talk about that. Yeah, he crushed. In fact, I had a student tell me the other day that they had a friend who would not read Dante because he thought Dante's obsession with Beatrice bordered on stalking. And I was like, you need to read Purgatorio if you want to understand the relationship. All right, here's the context. The founding of the Dominicans and the Franciscans and the life of Thomas Aquinas are the immediate, they're current events. They're recent, within a century. They're recent figures. Edward I of England, the first mechanical clock. He writes the Divine Comedy probably 1310. Within 20 years, and he dies in 1320, within 20 years, Wycliffe is born, the 100 Years' War breaks out, we have Boccaccio and Chaucer. So Chaucer writes Canterbury Tales about 1390, and he draws on both Boccaccio and on Dante. Closer to him geographically, of course, he's using the Italian language, and he's from the city of Florence. Oh, it's moved. My slide is wrong. Those 2 dots, I had to add those. Those 2 dots, just imagine them in your mind, are shifted over here like this. So Florence is really here, and Ravenna is really here. Those are the 2 cities most closely associated with him. But it is a mistake to think of Dante as Italian, because there is no Italy in 1300. In 1300, it looks a little bit like this. This is actually a simplification. There never was an Italy in ancient times. There was the city of Rome that conquered the rest of the cities on the peninsula, but there was never an Italy. There was Rome. And in Dante's time, there is Florence and the Papal States and Lucca and Modena and Ferrara, the Republic of Venice and the Duchy of Milan. Even that, however, oversimplifies. But if I have to explain this to you, we'll be here all night. This is really what it looked like. This is as crazy and complicated as it was, and the arrows show the course of his life. He actually got involved in politics. His family was sort of upper middle class, almost among the nobles and patricians. He was in the city government. He owned some property. He lived on rents from the land that his family owned. And so he was serving in the government of the city of Florence and was sent on an embassy to Rome to negotiate with the Pope. I've forgotten what the issues were, but with all of this, you can imagine how complicated relations were. While he's in Rome, there's a political coup in Florence, and the government changes from one party to the other, and the party that Dante was a member of are the losers, and the leaders of that party, they're not killing everybody at this point, they're just exiling them. So Dante is declared persona non grata while he's in Rome and told, you can't come home. If you come home, we will kill you. So you are now exiled. You cannot return to Florence. And he never does. The rest of his life, he goes north. He spent a little time in Verona and Venice, and eventually in Ravenna, which is where he is living when he writes the Divine Comedy. The black Guelphs, the white Guelphs. Way too confusing. Bologna, Verona, Venice. So, the Commedia. He did not call it the Divine Comedy, by the way. It acquired that reputation after his death, after it was published. And by published, I mean after there were scribes making handwritten copies of it. There were no printing presses yet. But after it became widely known and was distributed, it was not just the Commedia, it became quickly referred to by everybody as the Divine Commedia, the angelic Commedia. So the Commedia is one single story. It's 14,000 lines of epic poetry divided into cantos. Each canto is about 136 to 150 lines. So I have an edition here, much marked up. The cantos, when printed in English, are probably, for 130 lines, you're talking 4 or 5 pages. So there's canto 4, starts there, and there's line 144, and it ends on 102. So about 4 or 5 pages of poetry for each poem. But there are 100 poems. And he invents a new rhyme scheme. It's not found in any classical poetry, was not found in any of his contemporary poets. He invents what's called terza rima. So each poem, each of the 100 poems, 135 to 150 lines, is made up of 3-line stanzas. 3 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines. And the rhyme scheme is the first 3 lines are rhymed A-B-A. Then the next 3 lines are rhymed BCB. And then the next 3 lines are rhymed CDC. So the middle line of each stanza rhymes with the first and third line of the next one. And the poem always ends with a single line that completes the rhyme from the middle of the stanza before it. And he does that for 100 poems. Now, that would be daunting in English. John Ciardi, who did a very good translation of the Commedia into English, said the reason for that is you have 14,000 lines of poetry, which means you need 5,000 triple rhymes if you're going to try and do it in English. And English compared to Italian is rhyme poor. It's like, what rhymes with orange? We don't, because we have words that we bring in from all sorts of languages, but primarily Anglo-Saxon, French, Latin, a few other things. And the Anglo-Saxon syllable is basically consonant, vowel, consonant. The Italian syllable, Italian words are built with a syllable that is consonant, vowel. Ta-ta-ta, giornata, un dolce giornata. So they always end with a vowel. Yeah, it's musical. And they have a rhythm. And if you've listened to Italian being spoken, it is almost poetry in everyday conversation. So Dante does have a much easier task of doing this structure than anybody would in English. So there is only one English translation I know of that tries to do terza rima, and that's the one by Dorothy Sayers. And it's an incredible accomplishment, and I love reading it. It's not a very good translation of the Italian. It doesn't quite work. Ciardi does what he calls open terza rima, where he only rhymed the first and the third line of each stanza. He doesn't try and braid them together, and that works. Musa, which I also recommend, Mark Musa, Professor Musa, just does blank verse. He keeps the rhythm. It's iambic pentameter. It's the same number of syllables for each line, but he doesn't try and do any rhymes at all. There's a translation by Mandelbaum, which is very good in the 50s. There's a translation by Longfellow. Both of those, by the way, are available on what's probably the best online resource for the Commedia at Columbia University in New York City. There's a professor of Italian there who has pioneered over the last 5 years digitaldante.columbia.edu. And it's the full text in Italian with a parallel column, and you can select the Mandelbaum or the Longfellow. So you can have the Italian and various English translations. And then there's notes, and there's even, she has an Italian native speaker reading it in Italian. You can have that play in the background while you listen. It's a very, very nice resource. And let me just give you a little bit of flavor. Canto 1, the first stanza. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, c'è la diritta via era smarrita. So vita, smarrita, and oscura then will rhyme with the next. And here is Musa's translation of that. And he keeps the rhythm. Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path. And that's a famous line, and that's how the setup begins. I promised I would talk a little bit about Beatrice. So who was she? How did she help Dante in the comedy? She's not Dante's dead girlfriend. I'm sorry, some of my students have arrived at that conclusion and say, oh yeah, what has Dante's dead girlfriend got to do with this part? She's not Dante's dead girlfriend. She was a woman whom he saw only twice, but who made a deep impression on him because of her beauty and her grace and her poise. And she inspired him. And in the Commedia, she does not appear in Inferno. She sends a helper for him. She sends a guide to help him, to guide him, to lead him through the Inferno and up the mountain of Purgatory. And then at the peak of the mountain of Purgatory, they are reunited, and she scolds him like a mother scolds a child. And he is just completely abashed. And she says, you have squandered your life and your talents. You have been more in love with your poets than you have been with the scriptures. What did you think you were? If we had not intervened, you would have wound up in hell. Here's the way to understand Dante and Beatrice. And I don't choose this just to be frivolous. There was a Dante Society in Oxford in the 20th century. And among the members of the Dante Society at Oxford University were J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And Tolkien and Lewis are both very deeply immersed in Dante. They both read Italian. And Tolkien, I promise you, is pulling Galadriel right out of the Commedia. Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings is Beatrice. And Gimli's reaction to Galadriel is the Pilgrim to Beatrice. Gimli's love for Galadriel has no physical dimension to it at all. But he is just absolutely entranced by her beauty. I won't go through all of this, but yeah, is Dante's love for her akin to idolatry or adultery? No. Is it weird? Does it give us a hint about how we should or could look at the world? And yeah, if you think Gimli and Galadriel, you will be on the right track to understanding Beatrice and what she means to Dante. All right, let's talk about the structure of the three parts of the Commedia. Here's the structure of hell, and it begins with a vestibule, the indifferent, and this is where all the Greek philosophers are, by the way, or the good ones, anyway. Limbo, and then as you go deeper, the punishments get more severe. The lustful, the gluttonous, the avaricious and the prodigal, the wrathful, the heretics, and then the seventh circle is where things get really bad because that's the circle of violence. And then as you descend below the seventh circle, you get to fraud. And then the very worst in the ninth circle is betrayal. And for Dante, this somewhat parallels the seven virtues and the seven deadly sins, at least for the first three levels, but it kind of breaks apart after that. We'll talk about those more when we get to the mountain of Purgatory. But what's interesting here is for Dante, the least serious of the sins in the second circle is lust. He says it's because it's disordered love. It's misdirected love. And it is a sin, and it is being punished. And those in that circle are not having any fun. But it's the least serious. The most serious is betrayal. Traitors. Traitors to their country, traitors to their friends, and of course the ultimate traitor, who is actually being tormented in the ninth circle at the bottom by Satan himself, Judas, Cassius, and Brutus. They're the three. We'll talk more about the ninth circle here in a minute. The other way to categorize these sins is that the top part there, the sins of incontinence, are the sins of the leopard. The three animals that he saw are symbolic. They blocked his path near Jerusalem. They're sins of youth and passion. More serious are the sins of the lion, sins of violence, sins of manhood, maturity, strength. And most serious are the sins of the wolf. Sorry, it wasn't a panther, it's a wolf. Because they are cold-blooded. They are sins chosen deliberately, consciously, intentionally. So the sins of youth and passion are impulsive, emotional. The sins of the wolf are the cold-blooded plotting of betrayal and murder. Not murder or passion, but murder that is a planned assassination. For Dante, that was the most serious. Here's another interesting sort of representation. I won't go through all the details there, but, and we'll get to Satan here in just a minute. I want to go back up to Canto 2, Francesca and Paolo, Canto 5. Francesca and Paolo, Francesca was put into an arranged marriage with a really ugly guy who had a very handsome brother named Paolo. And so, yeah, you can sort of plot the rest of that story from there. They are together, and Dante sees them. The two of them are caught up together in a flame. Love, they speak to him. O living creature gracious and so kind, who makes your way here through this dingy air to visit us, who stained the world with blood. If we could claim as friend the King of Kings, we would beseech him that he grant you peace, you who show pity for our atrocious plight. Whatever pleases you to hear or speak, we will hear and we will speak about with you, as long as the wind here where we are is silent. And she goes on, this is Francesca actually speaking. And Dante-the-Pilgrim, when finally I spoke, I sighed. Alas, all those sweet thoughts, and oh, how much desiring brought these two down into this agony. And then I turned to them and tried to speak. I said, Francesca, the torment that you suffer brings painful tears of pity to my eyes. But tell me, in that time of your sweet sighing, how and by what signs did love allow you to recognize your dubious desires? And she to me, there is no greater pain than to remember in our present grief past happiness, as well your teacher knows. But if your great desire to learn the very root of such a love as ours, I shall tell you, but in words of flowing tears. One day we read, to pass the time away, of Lancelot, of how he fell in love. We were alone, innocent of suspicion. Time and again our eyes were brought together by the book we read. Our faces flushed and paled. To the moment of one line alone, we yielded. It was when we read about those longed-for lips now being kissed by such a famous lover that this one, who shall never leave my side, then kissed my mouth and trembled as he did. Our Galilot was that book and he who wrote it. That day, we read no further. And then classic Dante, the poet move. All the while, the one of the two spirits spoke these words, the other wept in such a way that pity blurred my senses. I swooned as though to die and fell to hell's floor as a body dead falls. And you hear the rhythm. That rhythm's in the Italian as well. Fell to hell's floor as a body dead falls. Boom, boom, boom. So yeah, when Dante can't figure out how to write the transition from one level of hell to another, he just has the pilgrim faint and wake up in the next place. It's a nice little artistic flourish. All right, I won't, because I don't have enough time to give you the details, but he gets to the 9th circle. And it's not the fires of hell. The further down he goes, the colder it gets. And when he gets to the 9th circle is a frozen lake. And Satan is not ruling over a kingdom with a pitchfork, issuing commands to all his demons and devils. Satan is imprisoned, trapped in the center of this frozen lake. And he has 3 heads and 3 mouths, and the 3 mouths are chewing on Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. And then Dante and his guide. I haven't talked to you about his guide yet. The guide that Beatrice recruits for him is the poet Virgil, the author of the Aeneid. And of course, Dante is he's just fangirling all over Virgil from the beginning to the end. He's like, oh, Virgil, tell me, And Virgil always answers his questions. Virgil is his very patient guy, and Virgil is taking, and of course, Virgil had described visiting the underworld in the Aeneid. Virgil had gone down to try and find his father, Anchises. And while in the underworld, in the cave in Sicily, in Virgil's telling, he had actually not only seen the spirits of the dead, some being punished and some celebrating in the fields, but he had also seen the spirits of those who were going to be born in the future. So he actually saw the spirit of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar in that venture. And so Dante's clearly inspired in large part by Virgil. But so Virgil leads him over to Satan, and there's a little hole in the ice, and they go down the hole in the ice, and then Dante he gets the physics of the center of the earth correct. As they start down Satan's hairy body, which is like, covered with wool as a lamb, they get down to the level of the ice and they have to rotate 180 degrees to continue, because now they're going up toward the other side of the earth. So Dante knows exactly, or he imagines what exactly would happen if you passed through the center of the earth, the point at which everything is attracted. Your orientation would have to change 180 degrees. Dante, of course, knows the world is round, because everybody in the Middle Ages knew the world was round. The Greeks knew the world was round. Everybody knew the world was round. The idea that people thought the earth was flat is an invention of Washington Irving in the 19th century. He invents a debate between a superstitious monk and Christopher Columbus, which never happened. But Irving wanted to tell the story. So Dante knew the world was round. The Greeks knew the world was round. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth and got within 10%. Anyway, enough of that. On to the island of Purgatory. They go very quickly, no narrative. It's taken them 31 poems to get to the bottom of the Inferno, and in one poem, they get all the way up on the other side of the earth onto an island that's in the middle of the hemisphere of water. And on that island is this mountain, and they see a boat arriving, and it disembarking from the boat on the shores of the island are the souls of the dead. This is like the analog to Charon, who ferries the souls into Inferno. There's a boat that ferries the souls to the island of Purgatory, because everybody on their way to heaven passes through the island of Purgatory. Everybody on the mountain of Purgatory is on their way to heaven. In Inferno, they're fixed wherever they are. There's no motion. In Purgatory, there's constant motion and there's a constant ascent. And Purgatory, for Dante, is not a place of punishment, and the whole Catholic practice of selling indulgences to get your ancestors out of purgatory is 100 years into the future. This is not Dante at all. Dante is actually very critical of the church and its mercenary practices in fleecing the poor. He's very admiring of Dominic and Francis. The mountain of Purgatory is not a place of punishment. It's organized along the 7 deadly sins and the 7 virtues. And what's happening on each level is not punishment, it is sanctification. Everybody goes through every level. Everybody starts at the first level with pride, and you have to learn the virtue of humility and rid yourself of the vice of pride. And how do you do that? By suffering. So on that first level, the souls learning humility are all required to circle the mountain carrying heavy stones on their backs, so they have to bend over. And here's the interesting thing. Dante to speak with them, because he recognizes some of the people. Dante to go and speak with them, he has to bend over to walk alongside them. And so the pilgrim actually, without even consciously making a choice, going through the same disciplines. So for each terrace, there is a discipline, not a punishment, to rid yourself of the vice and to acquire the virtue, to be sanctified so that you are ready then to go into heaven. And he does mention, hey, there's some people that go straight up the mountain. If you'd already learned humility, you could skip that level. You just keep climbing. If you'd already learned some of these virtues, you didn't have to spend any time. But if you hadn't completed your sanctification in your earthly life, well, you had to be sanctified before you could enter into the presence of God. How does sanctification occur? Through suffering, through discipline. And of course, is an inversion of hell. The proud here and the proud here. And what's the last level? The lustful. So it's the last discipline to learn. It's the easiest one to learn. All you have to do is go through a little wall of fire. And then here's the really interesting detail. This is the invention of Dante. When he passes through that last ring, that last terrace, by the way, he's 3 days climbing the mountain. 3 days. When he passes through the fire, and he's acquired the virtue of chastity, and he discovers at the top of the mountain of Purgatory, he has entered into the Garden of Eden. It's not an analog of the Garden of Eden. It's the real Garden of Eden. It's the Garden of Eden that was actually pushed up by the mountain of Purgatory when Satan fell and caused inferno. The displacement of the space pushed up the mountain, and it pushed up the garden. It is the real historical Garden of Eden on the top of Mount Purgatory. And that is where he is reunited with Beatrice. And she arrives as the grand marshal of a parade. It's actually a Corpus Christi procession. And when she sees him, it's not, the two lovers running across the field in the Breck commercial with the flowing hair and the embrace. No, it's like, Dante, what were you thinking? Do you know how much trouble it was to get you up here? Now, everybody knows from the beginning that Dante-the-Pilgrim is going back to complete his life. That's commented upon and observed and noticed by people that they talk to all the way. So here's another representation of the structure, the earthly paradise. They get to the top. Here's everything laid out in one. So here is Jerusalem. Here is Inferno, and of course, the fall of Satan. The material that is the inverse causes the mountain on the other side, and then you go up through the spheres. And in the spheres, he begins to encounter souls who are already in heaven, who are sanctified. But he starts to encounter saints who are at various levels because of the imperfections of the life they lived before they were saved, before they were sanctified. And he speaks to people in the sphere of the moon and Mercury and Venus and the sun. The moon is the sphere of those who broke promises, because the moon is inconstant. Mercury, Venus, I'll talk some more about this here in just a minute. Oh, back to Purgatory. One other thing about Purgatory. Yes, remember we talked about sins of the youth, sins of violence, and sins of fraud. You have sins of perverted love, so loving the wrong things, pride, the envious, the wrathful. Defective love, there's a whole terrace for the slothful. They have to run. They're running laps. It's like the coach making you run laps. Everybody on that terrace, to learn the virtue of being industrious, they have to run laps. And excessive love. So covetous, gluttonous, lustful, it's not that possessions or food for the body or even physical intimacy are in and of themselves wrong, but if they are disordered, they are wrong. If it's excessive love or love out of the boundaries which God has set for them. Okay, skipping over that. Here we go. Here, pride. So here's Virgil. Here's Dante the Pilgrim talking to the souls undergoing the discipline, learning humility, and by bending over, he has to participate in the lesson. There's a structure. There is a whip and a bridle. That's the good example and the bad example. There is a specific prayer. There is a benediction. There is a particular discipline that is being imposed on them to learn the virtue. And there are songs. It's amazing. He invents holograms. He invents large, giant TV display screens on the walls. They're carved pictures, but then as he gets close to them, they're actually in motion and they're speaking. So Dante's imagining what we would call a television screen. When he gets to the further terraces of the sun, he sees theologians assembling in the air, and then he sees the just rulers assembling, and they are bright lights and they form shapes. It's a drone show. It's just amazing. Anyway, each terrace has this structure. For each terrace, there's a prayer. And he hears them singing hymns. Envy. This one always freaks my kids out. The discipline on envy is everybody on that terrace for a time, temporarily, has their eyelids sewn shut. Because envy enters in through the eyes. And it's the image of how a falconer trains a fledgling falcon. That's what they do to train them. They temporarily sew their eyelids shut. My kids are always like, you can see them kind of wince when we go over this. The wrathful, they're surrounded by smoke, which blinds them. The slothful is, running laps, okay. Avarice, inordinate desire. They have to lie in the dust and learn not to be pursuing things that attract their attention. The gluttonous are wandering through orchards with all kinds of luscious fruit on all of the branches, and they're not allowed to eat anything. And so they don't have physical bodies. The pilgrim does, but they don't. And so the physical expression of what their soul is going through is they're starving. It's a discipline. And then, yes, the wall of flame. Paradiso. Struttura de ultratomba dantesco. I love this one because all the captions are in Italian. There it is in English. There's the celestial rose. Turns out, we'll go back to this one here. When he meets people in this sphere, the breakers of vows, the lovers of glory, lovers, theologians, martyrs and crusaders, righteous rulers, contemplatives, the triumph of Christ, the 9 orders of angels, turns out they're not really there. All of the souls he talks to as he goes through these spheres are really up here in the celestial rose in the presence of God. They're holograms, essentially, that Dante is speaking to. And it's explained to him by Beatrice that we have done this, we have accommodated to your limited mind. We have accommodated your limited mind by only introducing you to these characters a little at a time so that you can better understand the accomplishments of their lives, the ways in which they are rewarded, but they are all really up here in the presence of God. And when you get to the presence of God, it is this celestial rose, which physically looks like a circular stadium. And the interesting thing about the circular stadium, and here are angels going back and forth, and the presence of God is just off the slide here at the top. The way Dante describes it, that circular tiered stadium, everybody in it is exactly the same physical distance from God. The people down at the bottom row are in the center directly below, but the people up in the cheap seats, the nosebleed section, they're closer to God because they're higher up. So everybody, here's the other amazing thing. Here's a diagram of the celestial rose. And he has the blessed of the Old Testament on one side and the saints of the New Testament on the other. Ruth, Judith, Rebecca, Sarah, Rachel, Eve. And Eve sits just underneath Mary. And on her left and right are Adam and Moses and Peter and John. So down here, of course, you have Augustine and Benedict and Francis and John the Baptist, surrounded by Lucy and Anne. But everybody is there. And they're all singing. And then we get to, what does God look like? There's nobody else who's ever done this. There's no other poet who says, I'm going to describe for you what I saw when I got in the presence of God. It is astonishing. So I'm going to go to Canto 33. very last of the 100 poems. There, near and far, nor adds nor takes away. For where God rules directly without agents, the laws of nature in no way apply. Into the gold of the eternal rose, whose ranks of petals fragrantly unfold, praise to the sun of everlasting spring. In silence, though I longed to speak, was I taken by Beatrice. Oh, sorry, wrong canto. That was 30. I need to be at 33. Yikes. Never mind. Well, you can never go wrong reading Dante. Here we go. Canto 33. Not that within the living light there was more than a soul aspect of the divine, which always is what it has always been. Yet as I learned to see more, and the power of vision grew in me, that single aspect, as I changed, seems to me to change itself. Within its depthless clarity of substance, I saw the great light shine into 3 circles, in 3 clear colors, bound in one same space. The first seemed to reflect the next, like rainbow on rainbow, and the third was like a flame equally breathed forth by the other 2. How my weak words fall short of my conception, which is itself so far from what I saw that weak is much too weak a word to use. O light, eternal, fixed in self alone, known only to yourself and knowing self, you love and glow, knowing and being known. That circling which, as I conceived it, shone in you as your own first reflected light when I had looked deep into it a while, seemed in itself and in its own self-color to be depicted with man's very image. My eyes were totally absorbed in it. As the geometer who tries so hard to square the circle but cannot discover, think as he may, the principle involved, so did I strive with this new mystery. I yearned to know, how could our image fit into that circle? How could it conform? But my own wings could not take me so high. Then a great flash of understanding struck my mind, and suddenly its wish was granted. At this point, power failed high fantasy, but like a wheel in perfect balance turning, I felt my will and my desire impelled by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Now, one of the other lovely details in all of this is the last word in Inferno is when Dante and Virgil emerge on the shores of Mount Purgatory, and he says, and we looked up and saw the stars. And the last word in Purgatorio, he's in the Garden of Eden with Beatrice, and he says, and now I was cleansed and sanctified and ready to rise to the stars. So stella, the Italian for stars, is the last word in the Inferno, it's the last word in Purgatorio, it's the last word in Paradiso. What moves the universe? The love that moves the sun and the other stars. It's the last line in the Commedia. Love moves the universe, moves everything. So here's the other fun thing. As Dante is moving through this imagined universe, from the hill outside Jerusalem through Inferno to the center of the earth, up to the base of the mountain and up to the top, and then ascending all the way to the celestial rose in the presence of God, he is from beginning to end moving in one direction. It's one arrow. The whole story is the story of Dante-the-Pilgrim eventually arriving in the presence of God, and then writing 14,000 lines of poetry to describe the journey. There is nothing like this in the literature of any other language. Go away. As T.S. Eliot says, there is Dante, and then there is every other poet at the next level down. Shakespeare, Chaucer, anybody else, don't care. There is Dante, and then there is everybody else. It is just amazing. So, if you only know the Inferno, you don't know the whole story yet. You need to read Purgatory and you need to read Paradiso. If you want to understand what Dante's whole story is about and get to the end of his story. It would like be reading Fellowship of the Ring and then putting the book down and not reading the rest. Not getting to Aragorn being crowned king at the top of Minas Tirith, which, by the way, is a city built on a mountain with 7 levels. And there's a tree at the top, and they're waiting to crown the king. I rest my case. Yes, and there's me in Florence, outside Santa Croce. They keep saying, we have a tomb for Dante in this church, Santa Croce. We have a statue of Dante outside. And Ravenna keeps saying, no, you exiled him. He's staying with us.
We have Dante.
Yeah, we have Dante.
Saying, well, too bad you don't have Dante.
So here's what I'm going to do in January, February, and March. Herr Professor Dr. Luther, Johann Sebastian Bach, and William Bradford, and John Winthrop. January 14th, February 11th, and March 11th. And Winthrop and Bradford, we think we know the story of the first Thanksgiving, but I'm going to tell you at this point that I don't think you do. So I will tell you about that, and I will tell you not just about the Pilgrims, but about the Puritans. The Pilgrims came in 1620. Winthrop came 10 years later, leading the Great Puritan Migration. And the Pilgrims brought 100 people on one ship. Winthrop led 10 ships, 700 people, 11 ships, 700 people, and over the next 10 years, 100,000 English Puritans from 1630 to 1640 migrated to New England. We'll talk about all that. They were Englishmen, and you need to understand them as Englishmen to understand the history of New England. So we'll do all of that when we get into 2025. Thank you. I got 5 minutes left to answer questions. I can't believe I got through all 50 slides, but I did. So, yes.
How was it received? That, obviously the whole thing is fantastic. But how was it received in the time that so much of his description of the Inferno was based around Greek myth, like Cerberus guarding the gate and Chiron and the centaurs and things like that?
Yeah. The Greek figures in Inferno, and they're not in Purgatory or Paradiso. But in Inferno, everybody just took as sort of ornaments. He's not really trying to say we should worship these pagan gods. In fact, the pagans are in limbo. He got a mixed reception. The popes didn't like it because he put several popes in hell. And devised rather ingenious punishments for them. He puts Muhammad in hell, by the way, but as a heretic, because he didn't know much about the history of Islam. There was a garbled version of Muhammad's life that believed that he had been a Christian bishop who became angry that he wasn't preferred and given a promotion that he wanted, and so he started his own religion. So Dante puts him in with the heretics. But because the poetry was so compelling, anybody who liked poetry, who loved literature, read him. So the same people that read Boccaccio and later Petrarch, the Renaissance authors, they all loved Dante. Chaucer read Dante. Shakespeare had read Dante. The popes didn't much care for it, but it wasn't written as a promotion of Roman religion. But it was deeply Christian. In fact, there's a wonderful essay in one of these, the Cambridge Companion. This is 16 different essays by different Dante scholars about Dante and the Bible. The source that he quotes most frequently in the 14,000 lines is the Bible. He quotes the Bible. He quotes Augustine. He quotes Dominic. He quotes Francis. He quotes Bonaventura. He has Aquinas as a guide in one of the spheres. And he's not a theologian. He's not a priest. He's not a monk. He's not a philosopher. But he's read all of that. He knows all of it. He's a little bit like Augustine in that regard. He is one of these polymaths who has read everything and knows everything and connects everything. Part of the difficulty of reading the Commedia is that he uses so many historical figures from his own age that we don't know who they are in some cases. In fact, some of the notes are really funny. You're noticing one from Shearer who says, I am completely at a loss to tell you what this line means because I don't know who he's talking about. And that happens more than once. He'll drop a name, and he'll drop a name not just from Florence, but some other Italian city, and say, oh, well, you all remember this ruler in this town and what he did. And we're all going, no, we don't know who you're talking about. What do you say? Scholars are still working on some of this stuff. For the Musa translation or the Chardi or the digital Dante at Columbia, there's about an equal number of pages of notes for the pages of poetry. So you have 4 or 5 lines devoted to one of the 100 cantos, and you'll have 4 or 5 pages of notes explaining, okay, this name that he drops here is this guy. When he gets to the theologians, he has a circle of 12 theologians, and then it's later supplemented by a second outer circle of 12 more, and the drones are flying and changing colors and forming shapes. And he doesn't give the names of all of them, but he makes little allusions to them. So he makes allusions, for instance, to the theologian, the saint who is buried in Ciel d'Oro, which is the ceiling of gold, which is in St. Peter's in Padua, which is where Boethius is buried. He never names Boethius, but he just expects everybody, all of his readers to know, oh, well, of course, if you talk about the one who is buried in the church with the ceiling of gold, of course, we know you mean Boethius. And it's like, no, nobody in the 21st century knows that you mean Boethius by that. The notes spell that out. That's, by the way, on my bucket list. I found out several years ago when I was teaching Augustine and teaching Boethius that they're both buried in that church. And so I'm like, okay, I got to go to, it's not Padua, it's Pavia. It's Pavia, just outside Milan. Okay, so what was the reaction to it? Yeah, the Catholic Church didn't much care for it because he's much more eclectic. And his account of purgatory doesn't, he says the prayers of those on earth can aid those going through the process of sanctification. But there's nothing about any money changing hands. And there's nothing about masses being said for people that helps. But prayers for intercessory prayer for people being sanctified is of assistance. But that's as far as he goes. So the Roman Catholic Church, especially 100 years later, when I talk about Luther, I'll get into all of that, what the church had fallen into by 1500 was a sort of a gross corruption and monetizing of various religious aspects where they basically were just extorting money from people because of their superstitions. The whole Reformation really is caused by a church building program gone badly wrong. They're trying to raise money to build the biggest church in the world, and so they're raising money with some really dubious schemes all over Christendom, and Luther kind of goes, can we talk about this? Because this is not right. But we got this huge church we want to build. The biggest church in the world should be in Rome. Everybody agrees that, right? And Luther's, well, okay, maybe, but you already got a lot of money, and what you're doing to raise money is not cool. So it's a church building program that they're raising money with dubious means. We'll talk about that in January. Luther's fun. Luther is big and boisterous and loud and obnoxious, and he's the guy you would want to go sit with in a party and listen to. He is a big, loud, he's a lot like Trump. And the aphorism that's applied to Peter absolutely applies to Luther in spades. Luther is sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. He makes some huge mistakes. There are some things he said that his friends and admirers wish he had never said. There are essays he wrote we wish he had never written. We'll talk about some of that too.
Could the same be said of Bonhoeffer?
I'm not as familiar with the details of Bonhoeffer's life, but I suspect for almost all of us, there are things when we get to the end of our lives that we kind of sort of say, yeah, there's some things I'd like to take back. There's some things I wish I had not done and not said.
Understand as well earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, I have not yet seen the movie. I've read a couple of biographies of him. I'm familiar with him, but haven't seen the movie yet. Anything else about Dante that I can answer for you? Feel free to come up here. I have the Doré 19th century French illustrations. I have a nice little coffee table book. Botticelli planned an illustrated edition of the Commedia with a Botticelli sketch for each of the 100 cantos that he never finished. But the 100 sketches are reproduced here. They had a museum exhibit a couple of years ago, and I couldn't resist buying the book. Don't tell my wife what it cost.
That strikes me as
I paid way too much money for that book.
That seems like a weird combination of procrastination in the industry, that he started all 100 sketches and didn't finish even one of them.
Yeah, well, there are like 4 or 5 that have, colored, finished touches. But even they're not completely finished. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for coming again. I hope I've whetted your appetite a little bit for Dante and helped you understand him and fit him into the bigger picture. And come back again in January. We'll do Luther. Good night.